Before I start on today's case, I just wanted to point out some kind of errata from the Wolski case that I would like to thank a YouTube user, the Grabix from Poland, for pointing out to me. When I did this case, I had mentioned that some of the translations kind of might be a little difficult, and I tried to do my best with some of the comic translations that were available. I apparently still got some wrong that I missed. If you recall, I talked about how he couldn't fall asleep because there was supposedly some woman with him that was new to the area, and she didn't know her way home, and she was unfamiliar with it. Apparently, that's again a mistranslation. What happened was there's this word that's like a colloquial word for a horse in Poland that I thought I caught all the mistranslations, but there's a couple of places I missed. And what the document is actually saying is that it was a new horse that was new to the area and unfamiliar to it. It wasn't that he had a passenger with him. And in fact, there was another place where I also missed a translation on the horse, where he talks about tying up the reins here. On one of them signaled me to get out and follow him. The other one also left. I tied the reins as I do when I leave Konya. Konya, that's actually should also say horse or mare. And so that user kindly pointed some of those errors out to me. He also pointed out that the fin like features that were supposed to be on these creatures' hands, the fins were actually supposed to be on every single finger. And it wasn't that they went from the like gloves up to the tips. It was that they the each individual finger had a fin on it that went from the tip to the first joint, and that somehow got passed along and became part of the case, this whole fin thing. And so there's quite a few details that kind of developed in this story from mistranslations from the comic. Some of the articles that you can find online are actually written based on the comic and translations from the comic. And so I just wanted to point out those errors real quick and thank YouTube user the Grabix for pointing those out. I wish I would have had a Polish speaker beforehand to help out with that, but thank you, the Grabix. Our case today is the Rosedale humanoid case. And this took place in Rosedale, Alberta, in Canada. Now, Rosedale is a community within the town of Drumheller, Alberta, Canada. It was previously a small hamlet within the former municipal district of the Badlands number 7, prior to them integrating the municipal district in with the city of Drumheller in 1998. Rosedale is found at the intersection of Highway 10 and Highway 56 and Highway 10X. It's about 8 kilometers or 5 miles southeast of Drumheller's main town and about 66 miles northeast of Calgary, Canada. Drumheller is perhaps most famous for its dinosaur fossils, and it's been called the dinosaur capital of the world. In fact, it has what's called the world's largest dinosaur statue. That's not the statue in the image. That's just the statue on the sign, but they do have a giant dinosaur statue there. And it's so it's famous for its fossils and its kind of beautiful geology, but it's not the beautiful Badlands geology and the dinosaur fossils that draw our attention to Drumheller today, although it may be what drew these occupants to Drumheller. And it was on the outskirts of the town of Rosedale. And you can kind of see in the map here, we have Rosedale. That's kind of to the northeast there of Calgary, to the south, southeast here of Edmonton quite a bit. And Alberta is just north of Montana there. And so this takes place on the outskirts of Rosedale. Miss Clappin, retired school teacher, Miss Esther Clappison, known as Nancy, amongst those that knew her, lived with her brother Bill in this small home amongst the shrouded mountains of the Badlands. Miss Clappison was an avid birder and rockhound, but it wasn't the sight of a rare bird that would get her attention on 8:50 p.m. the night of the full moon, June 9th, 1971. I'll point out now some sources say June 7th, and when I initially made this post online, I put it as June 7th, and that's because some of the books say June 7th. But I do believe this case actually happened on June 9th. That's when the full moon was. I looked it up, and that's when the original investigator reported it as on the 9th. And that's actually what she does say in the testimony here. And so, in a taped radio interview, she calmly described the event. Quote, on June the 9th, I was attracted to a light coming through the windows. I couldn't ascertain what it was all about, so I went to the front of my home where there was a porch. Accompanying me is my old yellow dog called George. I was surprised when I got there to see a rectangular-shaped lighted object down on the ground near an intersection of two roads. And these two roads are roughly about 200 feet from her house or porch area there. Recovering from her initial shock, she begins to take note of the various details in the scene before her. One end of a box-like object is open, revealing a diffused white light. Despite this light illuminating the surrounding area in front of it, and the fact that it's a full moon and she could kind of see the area around her, she was unable to see any actual structure to this object outside of this opening. So it's almost kind of like again, like you might imagine like a Star Trek craft that's cloaked. Only when somebody opens the door, you can kind of see into it, but you can't see the rest of the craft. So she can only see this opening. She can't see any other kind of structure or craft. And there's no sound or any other kind of indications of any kind of running machine. She also notices three occupants or men. These two human-like forms are moving about inside the object, and there's a third figure outside in a crouch position, and he's picking up rocks. These men were covered head to toe in what she called an olive green to drab green kind of baggy coveralls. None of them were over 5 feet tall, she said. Their faces were obviously covered. There is something in the hood that they could see through, kind of like keyholes. The hood appeared to be made of the same material as the suit that they were wearing. But I personally find the keyhole eyes kind of very fascinating, very creepy, kind of horror movie kind of way. But it was actually, it was the hands. Miss Clappison would say it was their hands that got me. They were like mittens, not exactly like a skidoo mitten, but you know, just the thumbs, very prominent thumbs going into points. I gathered that's why he was having difficulty picking up the rocks. They had these thin, flexible wrists, but did not appear to bend their elbows or knees. She did not notice their feet. And I put up as a kind of comparison there the Pascagoula case with Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker, because that's another entity that kind of had these claw-like hands with these kind of pointed kind of thumbs and fingers. Again, it doesn't really share a lot of similarities, but there's some similarities in the entity there as far as like the hands and stuff go. Now, Esther, she wasn't naive to the UFO topic. Esther was actually a listener of Canadian APRO investigator William Allen, or Bill Allen's monthly UFO broadcast on CFCN AM radio in Calgary. It was a show that I believe happened once a month on a Tuesday. I had a slide presented, but I deleted it. And so she was, I guess, an avid listener of the show. And one of the things he did on his show was he urged prospective UFO witnesses to look for any sort of like instrument panel when they have one of these sightings. So she said, so the first thing I did was I looked for one, she said, and I saw something that looked like an instrument panel at the far end of the object. The humanoid at this time had realized someone was there, me, her. And I covered as much of it, the instrument panel, as he could with his person and his arm. He continually kept looking backwards to see that his arm was covering what was in front of the craft. The panel went right across the craft and was about 15 inches straight down, and there seemed to be darker shapes on the down part. She kind of described it as like a splotch. She kind of saw a splotch on this instrument panel. And this man that was covering this instrument panel motions to his companion inside the craft, who then made, in turn, gestures to his companion outside the craft as if to beckon him back inside the craft. The man outside there, she says, was obviously picking up samples. I guess it was a rock, not dirt, because he wasn't picking. He was picking, not scooping. After a moment, I tried to get closer and have a real eyeful, but the old dog wouldn't let me. He was scared to death and pushed me right back. There's quite a push, you've got to admit. Well then, I came in to attract my brother's attention. Then I looked through the window to see the object again and what they were doing, but there wasn't even the light. When I returned with my brother, there was nothing there. So help me, I hadn't been drinking. I'm not a drinking woman. Now, and so she, when she says her dog pushed her, I guess what she means is her dog more pulled her on the leash. She had the dog on the leash and it kind of pulled her, tried to pull her back to the house. That's my understanding anyways. The next morning, the Clappisons went out to inspect the area where the object was sighted and found a scorched area on the ground along the edge of the road. This burned imprint was about 20 feet long and I guess about 5 feet wide. I guess the same dimensions as the window. It's a bit unclear. One of the problems with this case is that there's not a lot of detail on not a lot of information. There was the prime investigator and then two other guys that kind of I believe showed up later on, but there's just not a lot of detail to go on. But they said it was about 20 feet long. And if you recall, she couldn't actually see the craft. She could only see that kind of window that was about 5 by 8 feet or so. Now, the discrepancy between the scorched imprint and the reported dimension of the box-like craft could be explained in a variety of different ways. She could have been off in her initial estimates of the window that she saw. The larger burning area could be due to the craft possibly shifting in position during takeoff or landing. Or the craft, or there was a craft that extended beyond these window dimensions as if it was, I don't know, like a cloaked ship of some kind. But that was just not visible to her. And so that could possibly explain the slight discrepancies between the imprint they found and the dimensions of the box that she saw at the time. Now, but by all accounts, Miss Clappison was a very trustworthy and respected member of this community. It was actually a community her family immigrated to from England in 1919, and she spent her entire life basically living in and was an outstanding member of this community. I believe her father was a manager at the mines. This was a mining town, and until these coal mines and stuff essentially shut down, I guess in the 70s, this was a big mining town. That's kind of why it was founded. And her family her father worked in the mine, and she lived in that town basically her entire life. In fact, it was said that the hills don't belong to the Clappisons, but the Clappisons belong to the hills. And Miss Clappison was actually, she shares some similarities to my mom, actually. She was a retired school teacher who served the area in that role for over 28 years. My mom was actually a school teacher in Alberta, Canada in the 70s. Miss Clappison would have been retired at this time, but my mom actually visited Drumheller around this time period as well. So she was this retired school teacher, but even though she was still in retirement, she still hosted all these science field trips for local students. I found news clippings about like junior high school students coming to do like geology trips there. She had birding expeditions for academics and other local groups and organizations. She contributed to this local book on history for the region called The Hills of Home, Drumheller Valley. She was one of the main contributors to that, and they donated the profits of that book to a local nursing home. So it seems, quite unlikely that she would just fabricate the story out of thin air. And this case, again, involves physical traces that left a lasting impression that was still there even 4 to 5 months later. Both when Bill Allen came to investigate 4 or 5 months later in October, and when Brian James, who drew the beautiful illustrations that I've been showing you guys, when he visited a little after that. And I'll point out, Brian James is an excellent illustrator. I love his illustrations. He's illustrated quite a few great Canadian cases. So we've got these physical traces. And we're left to conclude basically that she was sincerely reporting her experience as she knew it. But it's unfortunate that her brother William was unable to corroborate this sighting. He was only able to see the later scorch marks that they found the following day. But this was, in fact, not actually the first time Miss Clappison had a UFO sighting. And I as a researcher, I love it when I find stuff like this because I could not find anybody else that mentioned this, but I was looking through the old Drumheller newspaper articles for any kind of mention of the Clappison name. And I found this, and it's using her name she used, around town, Nancy Clappison, instead of Esther Clappison. And it's a newspaper article from October 30th, 1957, in which she reported seeing a small ball of fire in the sky. And it says here, Rosedale lady sees rare sight in sky on Sunday. A keen observer and authority of bird life who often scans the skyways for objects of interest. Miss Nancy Clappison of Rosedale was among those who saw a small ball of fire which traversed the Alberta sky Sunday noon. The retired school teacher saw what appeared to be a ball of fire with smoke trailing from it. Dozens of persons in Edmonton and surrounding towns reported seeing a bright flash and vapor trail. The satellite was later identified as a meteorite by a member of the Edmonton branch of the Royal Astronomical Society. He added that it was rare to see a meteorite itself in the daytime. So while her first UFO sighting turned out just to be a meteor, in the sense that she didn't know what it was at the time. It was a UFO sighting, and it was reported in the paper at the time, which I thought was kind of quite cool. Now, Miss Clappison's sighting is what has been classified as a tourist and pit stop type sighting by Canadian ufologist John Musgraves. And this is actually from a publication of his, UFOs, Occupants, and Critters in Canada, I believe. Where he looks at a lot of occupant cases in Canada. And so in these tourist and kind of pit stop encounters, you have these occupants or these tourists or vacationers that appear to sort of be amateur geologists or naturalists of some kind. It's almost as if they were in the area and they saw something interesting and decided to stop by to check it out. So perhaps they saw an interesting geological formation or some local flora. Or, like I say, it's known for its dinosaur fossils and geology of the region. Perhaps they saw that and decided to stop by. And in these type of encounters, these entities basically like to collect these samples as if they're taking them back home with them. And we've heard this in many encounters where people report these entities either kind of picking up rocks, samples, kind of like, we did on the moon, or they're picking up flora, that they're, or even, animals, cows or whatever they're trying to take back with them, as if they're collecting samples, kind of like scientists. And it's almost like what I do on my geology is a hobby of mine. And when I go on trips, I bring these books with me, Roadside Geology, because whenever I see interesting geology, I stop, I look it up in my book, and I go and check it out. And it's almost as if these entities and these type of encounters are doing a similar kind of thing. And so in many of these cases, obviously, because they're on the ground and they're supposedly collecting samples, they do tend to leave trace cases, such as the scorched imprint found in this Clappison case. But if the goal is to collect samples, that might perhaps be easier to do without any sort of human attention. The men in this case did seem to enjoy their privacy, obscuring the view of the instrument panel from Miss Clappison. And when they noticed that she was watching them, they immediately gestured for the companion to come back in so they could take off again. So it's like they don't want to be noticed. But if that's the case, why do they land so close to human occupations? Why do they land on the street in front of this lady's house? This is the Badlands. Rosedale is a small area. In 1971, there was 126 people, according to the census, living there. It's not all that much bigger now. I think it's about 300 something people. And so it's a wide area. There's lots of places that could have collected samples, but they collected the sample here. Now, this next case happened a year earlier in Duncan, British Columbia. And while it doesn't share all the details of the Rosedale case, it could be considered what you might call a stopping by for a view or a flyby kind of like case. So in a sense, they sort of are like tourists, but they're not getting out collecting the sample like you do in a pit stop kind of case. And also in this case, when the occupants noticed her, they made an effort to basically take off and kind of get out of there. Now, this case happened January 1st, 1970 in Duncan, British Columbia. At 5 a.m. to this registered nurse, Doreen Kendall. And she's on shift at the Cowichan District Hospital, checking on a patient who she thought might be too warm. And she's actually with, there's another nurse with her, Frida Wilson. And it's unclear. In some of the stories, they say she was checking on a patient on the other side of the hall, while Doreen Kendall checked on this patient that was kind of on the window side. Other reports say she was actually in the room. I've not seen the inside of the hospital, so I don't know what the layout is. But all we need to know is that Doreen Kendall saw this first part of the sighting, and this other nurse, Frida Wilson, didn't see this initial part of the sighting. So Doreen Kendall goes into this hospital room to check on this patient she thought might be too warm. And this patient, some reports say it was a male, but in a recent article from the last year, actually say it was a lady named Joanne who is just recovering from childbirth, who actually claimed to see the lights herself. She said she woke up in all the commotion and saw the lights herself, but there's no record of that at the time. And so she opens up this window to open up the blinds, perhaps let some window in or whatever. and she sees this bright kind of Saturn-shaped object about 50 feet in diameter hovering one story above her. It's about 60 feet off the ground and about 40 feet away. This object has a row of lights around its middles. She can see two human figures inside in dark, tight-fitting clothing and wearing headgear in the upper portion. One stands at this instrument panel, and it says this instrument panel kind of covers up the large part of the dome of this top half of this vehicle, like 3/4 of the space, and that is taken up by this instrument panel that kind of almost goes up to the top of that dome there. And so she sees this humanoid figure in there, one standing at the instrument panel and the others behind it. And she says these kind of like stools or something that they sit on as well. The second being looks directly at Kendall, and as of noticing that she's looking at them, touches the first being, who then moves this lever, which she describes as like a joystick in an old aircraft. And when this being moves this lever in what she describes as this very deliberate up and down motion, this craft seems to kind of tilt down, providing a view of its interior. And we can kind of see in this illustration here, it's kind of tilted, so it's kind of face forward, and so the back end is higher up, and it gives her this better view of inside the craft. Now, Kendall calls for other witnesses, that Frida Wilson, nurse, and she arrives in time basically to see the UFO leave, but she can't see the occupants in it. She basically just sees this bright glowing light that's kind of out there that obscures anything else but this light, and then it kind of flies off. And there's actually two other nurses that were, I guess, in that ward at the time, a nurse Appleby and a nurse Claxon, that also saw this, but again, they only saw the lights moving. The only person that actually saw these occupants at the time was Miss Doreen Kendall. And in 2023, an older gentleman named Dan Hughes would claim that the UFO was actually just this kind of inflated plastic bag lit by candles that he and two of his friends launched. But that explanation has been contested. It's been suggested that now this wasn't the only sighting that day. There was another sighting roughly at the same time, and there was a sighting, I believe, about 12 miles south in Mill Bay, British Columbia, later that evening by the Drummond family that also had an encounter. And it's been suggested that some of those other sightings were actually just one of these like inflated balloons or plastic balloons lit with candles. But the guy that investigated the case, the Kendall case, is convinced the Kendall case was actually legitimate. It was, I guess, just the later cases that were not. And Canada actually came out with a series of coins kind of commemorating some of their most famous cases. And they did one for this case that we can see here. And it's actually kind of quite cool. On the back, the coin is actually, if you shine at it with a black light, it kind of fluoresces in a certain way that you can see there, which is very interesting. I would love to actually get some of these coins. Unfortunately, they're kind of quite rare and they're quite expensive. While they are $20 coins, they're made out of pure silver, and so they actually sell for something like $100-something a piece, if you can even get your hands on them, because they sell out pretty quickly. And in listening to a podcast about this case, I actually learned the great Canadian ufologist Chris Rutowski had a role in kind of helping to get these coins created, which is very cool. And so that was another Canadian case. I will just mention one other case real quick here. The Carl Higdon, the alien abduction of a Wyoming hunter, Carl Higdon. Because this case actually, perhaps as far as like the description of this luminous box is concerned, perhaps shares more details with the Rosedale case. And this case happened on October 25th in 1974 in the Medicine Bow, the northern edge of the Medicine Bow National Forest, southeast of Wallings, Wyoming. And Carl Higdon Jr. was an oil digger, and he is hunting elk on the northern edge of this national forest when he sees 5 elk that are just kind of standing motionless, and he attempts to shoot one of these elk, but the bullet falls short about 50 feet from him, as if hitting this kind of invisible obstruction. So again, it's kind of almost like there's like a cloaked ship there, and he shoots at it, shoots at something invisible, and his bullet just kind of bounces off there. As he goes to pick up this bullet, he hears this twig snap, and he sees this humanoid being more than about 6 feet tall under a tree about 50 feet away. It has these hairs sticking up like wheat straws, is bow-legged, and is wearing a black coverall suit and black shoes. It's got 2 belts that cross his chest, and another is wrapped around its waist. The being asks Higdon how he is doing and whether he is hungry, after which he tosses him basically this package of pills, which, okay, package of pills, cool. I don't know, these are supposed to be food pills, or I guess they're medicine pills, and tells him to take one, saying that it's going to last 4 days. And I guess Higdon takes one or something. I don't know why you would take a pill that somebody tells you is going to last 4 days, but whatever. So he takes one of these, right? And Higdon looks up this hill and he sees this kind of transparent lighted cubicle, kind of like Miss Rosedale saw this, just kind of like this luminous, like lighted box with nothing kind of else around it. And suddenly he finds himself inside of this kind of lighted cubicle, strapped to his seat with a helmet on his head. There are 2 humanoids inside with him, as well as 4 seats, a control panel, a mirror, a map, and these several elk that are kind of frozen in a cage. Which, if you recall the Wolski case, we had these kind of these rook, or these ravens that were kind of frozen or paralyzed or immobilized. They weren't in a cage, but in this case, apparently these creatures had these elk that were immobilized in a cage. And they take him in this craft to what seems to be another planet, where there's this big mushroom-shaped tower that's 100 feet tall. He and one of the humanoids, I guess, float to this tower, kind of in the air. They go down an elevator, pass down the corridor, and go into a room with the platform. After being screened with some sort of kind of glassy shield, Higdon is then told, basically, you're no good. You're not any good for what we need, they say, and is taken back to his original location, where he basically ends up rolling down the hill. So it's almost like they just dropped him off and booted him out of the craft, and he rolls down this hill, right? And he hits his head and his neck and his shoulder. And at about 6:30 p.m., he ends up writing to his boss, Roy Fleming, at the well service that he works at in Rawlins, with his location and ask him for assistance. A little before midnight, he is found by a rescue party, which includes his boss, Fleming, the Carbon County Sheriff, a deputy, and some other men in several 4-wheel drive pickup trucks. And I guess he seems confused. He kind of doesn't remember what happened. He's taken to the Carbon County Hospital, unable to even remember his own name. And apparently he doesn't recover these memories for another couple of days until evening October 27th. But most of the details were not emerged later until he was hypnotized by Leo Sprinkle in November. And so, yeah, this case, well, this case is more of an abduction case and has a lot more other details that are quite not per se like the Rosedale case. Although you could almost also consider it like a pit stop, or because they stopped by, apparently collected some elk, but then apparently they collected him too. But it does share. It's the only case that I've been able to find so far that I can think of where we have this kind of, again, a luminous box where you can't see any other structure to the craft, but it appears that there is one, because, like I say, he shoots a bullet at it and it kind of supposedly falls off. And there is a picture of the bullet I didn't include in my presentation, but that's 2 luminous box cases, and kind of 2 cases where people, where these occupants seemed to notice that they were being watched and then kind of took off. And then unfortunately, in both these cases, both the Kendall case and the Rosedale case, when other witnesses were attempted to be got to see it, they missed it. Miss Clappison's brother missed the object when she went to go get him. It was no longer there. And in Miss Kendall's case, while they saw this object or this light flying around, they did not get to see or corroborate the occupants that she saw in the craft. That basically does it for my cases today. I wanted to thank, I did start a Patreon, and I do have a couple of, and I've been saying, and I apologize, saying that I didn't have any Patreons, because apparently Patreon does not message me saying when I get somebody to sign up. But I do want to thank my Patreon prescriber, Kevin, who signed up a few months ago. I thank you for your support, and my Patreon subscriber, Ben, who signed up in this last month. I really appreciate that, guys.